Chapter 7. It was dark when the airliner limousine reached LaGuardia Field. I had intended taking an earlier plane, but Dewberry persuaded me to stay over for dinner. We dropped into the Algonquin, next door to True's office building. Halfway through dinner, I asked John what he thought of the space travel answer. "Oh, it's possible," he said cautiously. "The time and space angles make it hard to take, but if we're planning to explore space within 50 years, there's no reason some other planet people couldn't do it. Of course, if they've been observing us for over a century, as those old sightings seem to indicate, they must be far ahead of us, at least in technical progress." Later on, he said thoughtfully, "Even though it's possible, I hate to think it's the answer. Just imagine the impact on the world. We'd have to reorient our whole lives, and things are complicated enough already." Standing at the gate, waiting for my plane to be called, I thought over that angle. Assuming that space travel was the solution, which I still couldn't believe what would be the effect on the world. It was a hard thing to picture. So much depended on the visitors from space. What would their purpose be? Would they be peaceful or hostile? Why had they been observing the Earth so intensively in the past few years? I could think of 100 questions. What would the space people be like? Would they be similar to men and women on Earth, or some fearsome buck-rogerish creatures who would terrify the average American, including myself? It was obvious they would be far superior to us in many ways. But their civilization might be entirely different. Evolution might have developed their minds, and possibly their bodies, along lines we couldn't even grasp. Perhaps we couldn't even communicate with them. What would be the net effect of making contact with beings from a distant planet? Would Earthlings be terrified, or, if it seemed a peaceful exploration, would we be intrigued by the thought of a great adventure? It would depend entirely on the space visitors' motives, and how the world was prepared for such a revelation. The more I thought about it, the more fantastic things seemed. And yet it hadn't been too long since airplane flight was considered an idiot's dream. This scene here at LaGuardia would have seemed pure fantasy in 1900. It was a hard thing. Huge constellations and DCSIXS, the double-deck stratocruisers, sweeping in from all over the country, the big ships at Pan American, taking off for points all over the globe. We'd come a long way in the 46 years since the Wright brothers' first flight. But space travel. The gateman checked my ticket, and I went out to the Washington plane. It was a luxury ship, a 52-passenger, 4-engine DC-6, scheduled to be in the capital 1 hour after takeoff. By morning this plane, the Aztec, would be in Mexico City. The couple going up the gangway ahead of me were in their late 60s. 50 years ago, what would they have said if someone had predicted this flight? The answer to that was easy. At that time, high school songbooks featured a well-known piece entitled, "Darius Green and His Flying Machine." Darius, it seems, was a simple-minded lad who actually thought he could fly. 50 years. That was the time the Air Force had estimated it would take us to start exploring space. Would Americans come to accept space travel as matter-of-factly as the people now boarding this plane? The youngsters would, probably. The older ones, as a rule, would be a little more cautious. In the oval lounge at the rear of the plane, I took out the file of old sighting reports. Glancing through it, I saw excerpts from 19th century astronomical and scientific journals and extracts from official gazettes. Most of the early sightings had been in Great Britain and on the continent, with a few reports scattered around the world. The American reports did not begin until the latter part of the century. The DC-6 rolled out and took off. For a few minutes I watched the lights of Manhattan and Greater New York twinkling below. The Empire State Building tower was still above us, as the plane banked over the East River. We climbed quickly, and the familiar outline of Manhattan took shape like a map pinpointed with millions of lights. Any large city seen from the air at night has a certain magic, New York most of all. Looking down, I thought, what would a spaceman think, seeing this brilliantly lighted city, the towering skyscrapers? Would other planets have such cities? Or would it be something new and puzzling to a visitor from space? Turning back to the old reports, I skipped through until I found the American sightings. One of the first was an incident at Bonham, Texas, in the summer of 1873. It was broad daylight when a strange, fast-moving object appeared in the sky, southwest of the town. For a moment, the people of Bonham stared at the thing, not believing their ears. The only flying device then known was the drifting balloon. But this thing was tremendous, and speeding so fast its outlines were almost a blur. Terrified farmers dived under their wagons. Townspeople fled indoors. Only a few hardy souls remained in the streets. The mysterious object circled Bonham twice, then raced off to the cast and vanished. Descriptions of the strange machine varied from round or oval to cigar-shaped. The details of the Bonham sighting were later confirmed for me by Frank Edwards, Mutual Network newscaster, who investigated this case. 24 hours after the Bonham incident, a device of the same description appeared at Fort Scott, Kansas. Panic-stricken soldiers fled the parade ground as the thing flashed overhead. In a few seconds it disappeared, circling toward the north. Until now, I had supposed that the term, saucer, was original with Kenneth Arnold. Actually, the first to compare a flying object with a saucer was John Martin, a farmer who lived near Denison, Texas. The Denison Daily News of January 25, 1878, gives the following account. From Mr. John Martin, a farmer who lives some 6 miles south of this city, we learn the following strange story. Tuesday morning while out hunting, his attention was directed to a dark object high up in the southern sky. The peculiar shape and velocity with which the object seemed to approach riveted his attention, and he strained his ears to discover its character. When first noticed, it appeared to be about the size of an orange, which continued to grow in size. After gazing at it for some time, Mr. Martin became blind from long looking and left off viewing it for a time in order to rest his eyes. On resuming his view, the object was almost overhead and had increased considerably in size, and appeared to be going through space at wonderful speed. When directly over him, it was about the size of a large saucer, and was evidently at great height. Mr. Martin thought it resembled, as well as he could judge, a balloon. It went as rapidly as it had come and was soon lost to sight in the heavenly skies. Mr. Martin is a gentleman of undoubted veracity, and this strange occurrence, if it was not a balloon, deserves the attention of our scientists. In the file, I saw a memo Dewberry had written. I would take the very early reports with caution. For instance, the one on August 9, 1762, which describes an odd, spindle-shaped body traveling at high speed toward the sun. I recall that Charles Ford accepted this, along with other early sightings, as evidence of space ships. But this particular thing might have been a meteor. Meteors as such were almost unknown then. The later reports are more convincing, and it is also easier to check the sources, especially those from 1870 on. From 1762 to 1870, the reports were meager. Some described mysterious lights in the sky. A few mentioned round objects seen in daylight. Even though they were not so fully documented as later ones, one point struck me. In those days there was no telegraph, telephone, or radio to spread news rapidly and start a flood of rumors. A sighting in Scotland could not be the cause of a similar one 2 days later in the south of France. Beginning in 870, there was a series of reports that went on to the turn of the century. In the London Times, September 26, 1870, there was a description of a queer object that was seen crossing the moon. It was reported as elliptical, with some kind of tail, and it took almost 30 seconds to complete its passage of the moon. Then in 1871, a large, round body was sighted above Marseilles, France. This was on August 1st. It moved slowly across the sky, apparently at great height, and was visible about 15 minutes. On March 22, 1880, several brilliantly luminous objects were reported seen at Keyhoe, Germany. Sighted just before sunrise, they were described as rising from the horizon and moving from east to west. The account was published in the British Nature magazine, Volume 22, page 64. The next report in the file mentioned briefly a strange round object seen in the skies over Bermuda. The source for this account was the Bermuda Royal Gazette. This was in 1885. That same year, an astronomer and other witnesses reported a gigantic aerial object at Adrianople, Turkey. On November 1st, the weird apparition was seen moving across the sky. Observers described it as round and 4 to 5 times the size of the moon. This estimate is similar to the Denison, Texas, comparison with an orange. The object would actually be huge to be seen at any great height. But unless the true height were known, any estimate of size would be guesswork. On March 19, 1887, 2 strange objects fell into the sea near a Dutch barkentine. As described by the skipper, Captain C., Sweet. One of the objects was dark, the other brightly luminous. The glowing object fell with a loud roaring sound. The shipmaster was positive it was not a meteor. In New Zealand, a year later, an oval-shaped disk was reported speeding high overhead. This was on May 4, 1888. About 2 years after this, several large aerial bodies were sighted hovering over the Dutch East Indies. Most accounts describe them as roughly triangular, about 100 feet on the base and 200 feet on the sides. But some observers thought they might be longer and narrower, with a rounded base. This would make them agree with more recent stories of cone-shaped objects with rounded tops seen in American skies. On August 26, 1894, a British admiral reported sighting a large disk with a projection like a tail. And a year after this, both England and Scotland buzzed with stories of triangular-shaped objects like those seen in the Dutch East Indies. Although many officials scoffed at the stories, more than one astronomer stuck to his belief that the mysterious things might be coming from outer space. Since planes and dirigibles were then unknown, there was no one on Earth who could have been responsible for them. In 1897, sightings in the United States began to be more frequent. One of the strangest reports describes an incident that began on April 9th. Flying at a great height, a huge cigar-shaped device was seen in the Midwest. Short wings projected from the sides of the object, according to reports of astronomers who watched it through telescopes. For almost a week, the aerial visitor was sighted around the Midwest, as far south as St. Louis and as far west as Colorado. Several times, red, green, and white lights were seen to flash in the sky. Some witnesses thought the crew of this strange craft might be trying to signal the Earth. On April 16th, the thing, whatever it was, disappeared from the Midwest. But on April 19th, the same object, or else a similar one, appeared over West Virginia. Early that morning the town of Sisterville was awakened by blasts of the sawmill whistle. Those who went outside their homes saw a strange sight. From a torpedo-shaped object overhead, dazzling searchlights were pointing downward, sweeping the countryside. The thing appeared to be about 200 feet long, some 30 feet in diameter, with stubby wings and red and green lights along the sides. For almost 10 minutes the aerial visitor circled the town, then it swung eastward and vanished. The next report was published in the U.S. Weather Bureau's monthly weather review. On page 115 in the March 1904 issue, there is an account of an odd sighting at sea. On February 24, 1904, a mysterious light had been seen above the Atlantic by crew members of the USS Supply. It was moving swiftly, and evidently at high altitude. The report was attested by Lieutenant Frank H. Schofield, USN. On July 2, 1907, a mysterious explosion occurred in the heavens near Burlington, Vermont. Some witnesses described a strange, torpedo-shaped device circling above. Shortly after it was seen, a round, luminous object flashed down from the sky, then exploded. Weather Review, 1907, page 310. Another cigar-shaped craft was reported at a low altitude over Bridgewater, Massachusetts, in 1905. Like the one at Sisterville, it carried searchlights, which swept back and forth across the countryside. After a few moments, the visitor rose in a steep climb, and the searchlights blinked out. There was no report for 1909 in America, though an odd aerial object was sighted near the Galapagos Islands. But in 1910, one January morning, a large silvery cigar-shaped device startled Chattanooga. After about 5 minutes, the thing sped away, appearing over Huntsville, Alabama, shortly afterward. It made a second appearance over Chattanooga the next day, then headed east and was never seen again. In Popular Astronomy, January 27, 1012, a Dr. F. B. Harris described an intensely black object that he saw crossing the moon. As nearly as he could tell, it was gigantic in size, though again there was no way to be sure of its distance from him, or the moon. With careful understatement, Dr. Harris said, "I think a very interesting and curious phenomenon happened that night. A strange shadow was noted on the clouds at Fort Worth, Texas, on April 8, 1903. It appeared to be caused by some large body hovering motionless above the clouds. As the cloud layer moved, the shadow remained in the same position. Then it changed size, diminishing, and quickly disappeared, as if it had risen vertically. A report on this was given in the Weather Bureau Review of that year, number 4 to 599. By 1919, dirigibles were of course well known to most of the world. When a dirigible-shaped object appeared over Huntington, West Virginia, in July of that year, there was no great alarm. It was believed to be an American blimp, though the darkness, it was 11 at night, prevented observers from being sure. But a later checkup proved it was not an American ship, nor was it from any country possessing such craft. For some time after this, there were few authentic reports. Then in 1934, Nicholas Roerich, head of the American Roerich expedition into Tibet, had a remarkable experience that bears on the saucer riddle. On pages 361 and 362 of his book Altai Himalaya, Roerich describes the incident. The expedition party was in the wilds of Tibet one morning when a porter noticed the peculiar actions of a buzzard overhead. He called Roerich's attention to it. Then they all saw something high in the sky, moving at great speed from north to south. Watching it through binoculars, Roerich saw it was oval-shaped, obviously of huge size, and reflecting the sun's rays like brightly polished metal. While he trailed it with his glasses, the object suddenly changed direction, from south to southwest. It was gone in a few moments. This was the last sighting listed before World War II. When I had finished, I stared out the plane window, curiously disturbed. Like most people, I had grown up believing the earth was the center of everything: life, intelligence, and religion. Now, for the first time in my life, that belief was shaken. It was a curious thing. I could accept the idea that we would eventually explore space, land on the moon, and go on to distant planets. I had read of the plans, and I knew our engineers and scientists would somehow find a way. It did not disturb my belief in our superiority. But faced with this evidence of a superior race in the universe, my mind rebelled. For years, I had been accustomed to thinking in comic strip terms of any possible spaceman, Buck Rogers stuff, with weird-looking spaceships and green-faced Martians. But now, if these sightings were true, the shoe was on the other foot. We would be faced with a race of beings at least 200 years ahead of our civilization, perhaps thousands. In their eyes, we might look like primitives. My conjectures before the takeoff had just been idle thinking. I had not really believed this could be the answer. But now the question came back sharply. How would we react to a sudden appearance of spaceships, bringing that higher race to the Earth? If we were fully prepared, educated to this tremendous adventure, it might come off without trouble. Unprepared, we would be thrown into panic. The lights of Philadelphia showed up ahead, and a thought struck me. What would Philadelphians of 1776 have thought to see this DC-6 flying across their city at 300 miles an hour? What would the sentries at Valley Forge have done, a year later, if this lighted airliner had streaked over their heads? Madness. Stampede. Those were the plain answers. But there was a difference now. We had had modern miracles, radio, television, supersonic planes, and the promise of still more miracles. We could be educated, or at least partly prepared, to accept space visitors. In 50 years we had learned to fly. In 50 years more, we would be exploring space. Why should we believe such creative intelligence was limited to the Earth? It would be incredible if the Earth, out of all the millions of planets, proved the only inhabited spot in the whole universe. But instinctively, I still fought against believing that the flying saucers were spaceships. Eventually, we would make contact with races on other planets. They undoubtedly would someday visit the Earth. But if it could be put off, a problem for later generations to handle. If the discs proved American guided missiles, it would be an easier answer. Looking through the project, Saucer, report Dewberry had loaned me, I read the space travel items, hoping to find some hint that this was a smoke screen. On page 18, in a discussion on Mars, I found this comment. Reports of strange objects seen in the skies have been handed down through the generations. However, scientists believe that if Martians were now visiting the Earth without establishing contact, it could be assumed that they have just recently succeeded in space travel, and that their civilization would be practically abreast of ours. This because they find it hard to believe that any technically established race would come here, flaunt its ability in mysterious ways over the years, but each time simply go away without ever establishing contact. There could be several answers to that. The Martians might not be able to live in our atmosphere, except in their sealed spaceships. They, or some other planet race, could have observed us periodically to check on our slow progress. Until we began to approach their level of civilization, or in some way caused them concern, they would probably see no reason for trying to make contact. But somehow I found a vague comfort in the argument, full of holes though it was. Searching further, I found other space travel comments. On one page, the Air Force admitted it was almost a certainty that space travelers would be operating from planets outside the solar system. But on the following page, I discovered this sentence. Thus, although visits from outer space are believed to be possible, they are thought to be highly improbable. What was the answer? Was this just a wandering discussion of possibilities, badly put together, or was it a hint of the truth? It could be the first step in preparing America for a revelation. It could also be a carefully thought-out trick. This whole report might be designed to conceal a secret weapon. If the Air Force or the Navy did have a secret missile, what better way to distract attention? The old sighting reports could have been seized on as a build-up for space travel hints. Then suddenly it hit me. Even if it were a smoke screen, what of those old reports? They still remained to be answered. There was only one possible explanation, unless you discarded the sightings as lies. That meant discrediting many reliable witnesses, naval officers, merchant shipmasters, explorers, astronomers, ministers, and responsible public officials. Besides all these, there had been thousands of other witnesses, where large groups had seen the objects. The answer seemed inevitable, but I held it off. I didn't want to believe it, with all the changes it might bring, the unpredictable effect upon our civilization. If I kept on checking, I might find evidence that would bring a different explanation for the present saucers. Dewberry had put another group of reports in the envelope. This series covered the World War II phase and on up to the outbreak of the saucer scare in the United States. Some of it, about the Foo Fighters, I already knew. This was tied in with the mystery rockets reported over Sweden. The first Swedish sightings had occurred during the early part of the war. Most of the so-called ghost rockets were seen at night, moving at tremendous speed. Since they came from the direction of Germany, most Swedes believed that guided rockets were the answer. During the summer of 1946, after the Russians had taken over Piedmont, the Nazi missile test base, ghost rockets again were reported flying over Sweden. Some were said to double back and fly into Soviet areas. Practically all were seen at night, and therefore none had been described as a flying disc. Instead, they were said to be colored lights, red, green, blue, and orange, often blurred from their high speed. But there was a puzzling complication. Mystery lights, and sometimes flying discs, were simultaneously reported over Greece, Portugal, Turkey, Spain, and even French Morocco. Either there were two answers, or some nation had developed missiles with an incredibly long range. By January 1947, ghost rocket sightings in Europe had diminished to less than one a month. Oddly enough, the first disk report admitted by Project Saucer was in this same month. The first 47 case detailed by Project Saucer occurred at Richmond, Virginia. It was about the middle of April. A Richmond weather observer had released a balloon, and was tracking it with a theodolite when a strange object crossed his field of vision. He swung the theodolite and managed to track the thing, despite its high speed. The actual speed and altitude, the latter determined by a comparison of the balloon's height at various times, have never been released. Nor has the Air Force released this observer's report on the object's size, which Project Saucer admitted was more accurate than most witnesses' estimates. About the 17th of May 1947, a huge oval-shaped saucer 10 times longer than its diameter was sighted by Byron Savage, an Oklahoma City pilot. 2 days later, another fast-flying saucer was reported at Manitou Springs, Colorado. In the short time it was observed, it was seen to change direction twice, maneuvering at an unbelievable speed. Then on June 24 came Kenneth Arnold's famous report, which set off the saucer scare. The rest of the story I now knew almost by heart. When the DC-6 landed at Washington, I had made one decision. Since it was impossible to check up on most of the old sightings, I would concentrate on certain recent reports, cases in which the objects had been described as spaceships. As I waited for a taxi, I looked up at the sky. It was a clear summer night, without a single cloud. Beyond the low hill to the west I could see the stars. I can still remember thinking, if it's true, then the stars will never again seem the same. Chapter 8. Next morning, in the broad light of day, the idea of space visitors somehow had lost its menace. If the disks were spaceships, at least they had shown no sign of hostility, so far as I knew. Of course, there was Mantell, but if he had been downed by some weapon on the disk, it could have been self-defense. In most cases, the saucers retreated at the first sign of pursuit. My mind was still reluctant to accept the space travel answer, in spite of the old reports. But I kept thinking of the famous aircraft designer who thought the disks were spacecraft. The airline pilots Purdy had mentioned, Blake's co-pilot, Chuck. Now that I recalled it, Blake had been more embarrassed than seemed called for when he told about Chuck. Perhaps he had been the one who believed the saucers were spaceships, instead of his absent co-pilot. After breakfast, I went over the list of sightings since June 1947. There were several saucers that actually had been described as projectile-like ships. The most famous of all was the Eastern Airlines case. It was 8:30 p.m., July 23, 1948, when an Eastern Airlines DC-3 took off from Houston, Texas, on a flight to Atlanta and Boston. The airliner captain was Clarence S. Childs. During the war, he had been in the Air Transport Command, with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had 8,500 flying hours. His first officer was John B. Whitted, a wartime pilot on B-29s. Both men were known in Eastern as careful, conservative pilots. It was a bright, moonlit night, with scattered clouds overhead. The DC-3 was 20 miles west of Montgomery, at 2:45 a.m., when a brilliant projectile-like craft came hurtling along the airway.
Airway. Chiles saw it first and took it to be a jet plane. But the next instant both pilots saw that this was no jet fighter. It was heading southwest, Chiles said later, exactly opposite to our course. Whatever it was, it flashed down toward us at terrific speed. We veered to the left. It veered sharply, too, and passed us about 700 feet to the right. I saw then that it had no wings. The mystery ship passed on Whitted's side, and he had a fairly close look. The thing was about 100 feet long, cigar-shaped, and wingless, he described it. It was about twice the diameter of a B-29, with no protruding fins. Captain Chiles said the cabin appeared like a pilot compartment, except for its eerie brilliance. Both he and Whitted agreed it was as bright as a magnesium flare. They saw no occupants, but at their speed this was not surprising. An intense dark blue glow came from the side of the ship, Chiles reported. It was later suggested by engineers that the strange glare could have come from a power plant of unusual type. It ran the entire length of the fuselage, like a blue fluorescent light. The exhaust was a red-orange flame, with a lighter color predominant around the outer edges. Both pilots said the flame extended 30 to 50 feet behind the ship. As it passed, Chiles noted a snout like a radar pole. Both he and Whitted glimpsed 2 rows of windows. Just as it went by, said Chiles, the pilot pulled up as if he had seen the DC-3 and wanted to avoid it. There was a tremendous burst of flame from the rear. It zoomed into the clouds, its jet wash rocking our DC-3. Chiles's estimate of the mystery ship's speed was between 500 and 700 miles an hour. As the object vanished, Chiles went back into the cabin to check with the passengers. Most had been asleep or were drowsing. But one man confirmed that they were in their right senses. This passenger, Clarence McKelvey of Columbus, Ohio, told them and a Project Saucer team later that he had seen a brilliant streak of light flash past his window. It had gone too swiftly for him to catch any details. The AP interviewed Mr. McKelvey soon after he landed and ran the following story. Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, July 24, AP. Clarence L. McKelvey, assistant managing editor of the American Education Press, said he was the only passenger on the EAL Houston-Boston plane who was not asleep when the phantom craft was sighted. I saw no shape or form, Mr. McKelvey said. I was on the right side of the plane, and suddenly I saw this strange, eerie streak out of my window. It was very intense, not like lightning or anything I had ever seen. The Columbus man said he was too startled and the object moved too quickly for him to adjust his eyes to it. In Washington, Air Force officials insisted they could shed no light on the mystery. Out in Santa Monica, General George C. Kenney, then Chief of the Strategic Air Command, declared the Air Force had nothing remotely like the ship described. "I wish we did," General Kenny told reporters. "I'd sure like to see that." The publicized story of this spaceship set off another scare, also the usual cracks about screwball pilots. But Chiles and Whitted were not screwballs. They were highly respected pilots. The passengers' confirmation added weight. But even if all three had been considered deluded, the Air Force investigators could not get around the reports from Robbins Air Force Base. Just about 1 hour before the DC-3 incident, a strange flaming object came racing southward through the night skies over Robbins Field at Macon, Georgia. Observers at the air base were astounded to see what appeared to be a huge, wingless craft streak overhead, trailing a varicolored exhaust. The witnesses' description tallied with those of Chiles and Whitted. The mystery ship vanished swiftly. All observers agreed that it disappeared from the line of sight, just like a normal aircraft. While I was working on this case, a contact in Washington gave me an interesting tip. Within 48 hours after that Eastern sighting, Air Force engineers rushed out blueprint plans and elevations of the spaceship, based on what the two pilots told them. Whether or not this was true, I found that the Air Force engineers did compute the probable speed and lift of the mystery craft. The ship was found to be within the bounds of aerodynamic laws for operations in our atmosphere. Here is the Air Force statement. Application of the Prandtl theory of lift indicated that a fuselage of the dimensions reported by Chiles and Whitted could support a load comparable to the weight of an aircraft of this size, at flying speeds in the subsonic range. This supports Chiles's estimate of 500 to 700 miles per hour. 4 days after the spaceship story was published, a Navy spokesman was quoted as hinting it might have been a high-atmosphere rocket gone astray from the proving grounds in New Mexico. The brief report appeared on the editorial page of the Washington Star on July 28, 1947. It ran as follows. The Navy says that naval technicians have been testing a 3,000 mile-per-hour rocket in New Mexico. If one went astray, it could travel across our continent in a short time. At first glance, I thought this might be the real answer to the Chiles-Whitted case. But after a few minutes I saw it was almost impossible. First, rockets at White Sands are launched and controlled with utmost care. There have been no reported cases of such a long-distance runaway. Second, if such a rocket had gone astray, it would certainly have caused wild confusion at White Sands until they found where it landed. Hundreds of people would have known about it. The story would be certain to leak out. Third, such a rocket would have had to travel from White Sands to Macon, Georgia, then circle around south of this city for over 40 minutes. If it had kept on at the speed observed at Robbins Field, it would have passed Montgomery long before the DC-3 reached the area. In addition, the rocket would have had to veer sharply away from the airliner, as both pilots testified, and then zoom into the clouds. No high-atmosphere test rocket has automatic controls such as this would require. And if it had gone astray from White Sands, the station's remote control would no longer be guiding it. The Eastern Airlines spaceship, then, was not just a fugitive rocket. But it could be a new type of aircraft, something revolutionary, developed in absolute secrecy. Other airline pilots had reported flying discs racing along the airways, though none that I knew of had described projectile-like objects. Chiles and Whitted insisted the mystery ship was not a disc, and the report from Robbins Field agreed on this point. Man-made devices or not, it seemed fairly certain there was more than one type of saucer. The more I studied the evidence, the harder it was to believe that this was an Earth-made ship. Such a wingless rocket ship would require tremendous jet power to keep it in the air. Even our latest jet bombers could not begin to approach its performance. Going back over the Project Saucer preliminary report, I found strong evidence that the Air Force was worried. In their investigation, project teams had screened 225 military and civilian flight schedules. After 9 months, they reported that the mysterious object was no conventional aircraft. On April 27, 1949, the Air Force admitted that Project Saucer had failed to find the answer. The spaceship was officially listed as unidentified. But Wright Field is still working on it, an Air Force officer told me. Both Chiles and Whitted are responsible pilots, and McKelvey has a reputation for making careful statements. Even without the Robbins Field confirmation, no one could doubt that they saw something. The Chiles-Whitted spaceship was not the first of this type to be reported. Another wingless aircraft was sighted in August 1947 by 2 pilots for an Alabama flying service. It was at Bethel, Alabama, just after sunset, when a huge black wingless craft swept across their course. Silhouetted against the evening sky, it loomed larger than a C-54. The pilots saw no wings, motors, or jet exhausts. Swinging in behind the mystery ship, they attempted to follow. But at their speed of 170 miles per hour they were quickly outdistanced. Careful checking showed there were no other planes nearby that could have been mistaken for this strange craft. On New Year's Day, 1948, a similar rocket-shaped object was sighted at Jackson, Mississippi. It was first seen by a former Air Force pilot and his passenger, and later by witnesses on the ground. Before the pilot could begin to close in, the odd wingless ship pulled away. Speeding up from 200 to 500 miles per hour, it swiftly disappeared. Besides these 2 cases, already on record, I had the tips Purdy had given me. One wingless ship was supposed to have been seen 3 or 4 days before the Chiles-Whitted sighting. Like the thing they reported, the unidentified craft was a double-decked spaceship, but moving at even higher speed. At first I ran into a stone wall trying to check this story. Then I found a lead confirming that this was a foreign report. It finally proved to be from The Hague. The tip had been right. This double-decked, wingless ship had been sighted on July 20, 1948, 4 days before the Eastern case. Witnesses had reported it at a high altitude, moving at fantastic speed. While working on this report, I verified another tip. We had heard a rumor of a spaceship sighting at Clark Field, in the Philippine Islands. Although I didn't learn the date, I found that there was such a record. In the final Project Saucer report, the attempt to explain away this sighting was painfully evident. Analyzing this case, number 206, the Air Force said, if the facts are correct, there is no astronomical explanation. A few points favor the daytime meteor hypothesis: snow-white color, speed faster than a jet, the raw similarity to skywriting and the time of day. But the tactics, if really performed, oppose it strenuously. The maneuvers in and out of cloud banks, turns of 180 degrees or more, possibly these were illusions, caused by seeing the object intermittently through clouds. The impression of a fuselage with windows could even more easily have been a sign of imagination.
With this conjecture, Project Saucer listed the sighting as officially answered. The Hague spaceship case was unexplained. In following up the Jackson and Bethel reports, I talked with 2 officials in the Civil Aeronautics Administration. One of these was Charlie Plank, who handled public relations. I found that the pilots concerned had good records. CAA men who knew them discounted the hoax theory. Charlie, there's a rumor that airline pilots have been ordered not to talk, I told Plank. You know anything about it? You mean ordered by the Air Force or the companies, he said. The Air Force and the CAA. If the CAA's in on it, it's a top-level deal, said Charlie. I think it's more likely the companies, with or without a nudge from the Air Force. While we were talking, an official from another agency came in. Because the lead he gave me was off the record, I'll call him Steve Barrett. I knew Steve fairly well. We were both pilots with service training. Our paths had crossed during the war, and I saw him now and then at airports around Washington. When the saucer scare first broke, Steve had been disgusted. Damn fools trying to get publicity, he snorted. The way Americans fall for a gag. Even the Air Force has got the jitters. So I was a little surprised to find he now thought the discs were real. What sold you? I asked. The radar reports, said Steve. I know of half a dozen cases where they've tracked the things. One was in Japan. The thing was climbing so fast no one believed the radar men at first. Then they got some more reports. One was up in Canada. There was a case in New Mexico, and I think a Navy destroyer tracked a saucer up in the North Atlantic. What did they find out? Said Charlie Plank. Steve shrugged. I don't know all the answers. Whatever they are, the things can go like hell. I had a hunch he was holding back. I waited until he had finished with Charlie, and then went down the hall with him. You think the saucers are guided missiles? I said. If I thought so, I wouldn't be talking, he said flatly. That's not a dig at you. But I was cleared last year for some secret electronics work, and it might be used in some way with guided missiles. I didn't know that, Steve. It's okay, he said. I don't mind talking, because can't believe the saucers are guided missiles. Maybe few of the things sighted out in the southwest have been our test rockets, but that doesn't explain the radar reports in Canada and Japan. I'd already heard about a radar case in Labrador, I told Steve. He looked at me quickly. Where'd you pick that up? True passed it on to me, I said. They've had some trouble tracking the things, they maneuver so fast, said Steve. It sounds crazy, but I've been told they hit more than 10,000 miles an hour. You believe it? Well, it's not impossible. Those saucers were tracked about 50 miles up, where there's not much resistance. The elevator door opened. Steve waited until we were outside of the Commerce building. There's one other thing that gets me, he said. Unless the radar buoys are way off, some of those saucers are enormous. I just can't see a guided missile 500 feet in diameter. He stopped for a moment. I suppose this will sound screwy to you. You think they're interplanetary, I said. Steve was quickly on the defensive. I haven't bought it yet, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. Without mentioning names, I told him about the aircraft designer and the airline pilots. They're in good company, said Steve. You know the Air Institute? Sure, the Air Force school down at Montgomery. 6 months ago, I was talking with an officer who'd been instructing there. Steve looked at me, deadly serious. He told me they are now teaching that the saucers are probably spaceships. Chapter 9. 3 days after my meeting with Steve Barrett, I was on a Mainliner 300, starting a new phase of the saucer investigation. By the time I returned, I hoped to know the truth about Project Saucer. As the ship droned westward, 14,000 feet above the Alleghenies, I thought of what Steve had told me. I believed that he had told me about the radar tracking. And I was fairly sure he believed the Air Institute story. But I wasn't so certain the story itself was true. It would hardly be a gag. Steve wasn't easily taken in. It was more likely that one Institute officer, or perhaps several, believed the saucers were spacecraft and aired their personal opinions. The Institute wasn't likely to give an official answer to something that Project Saucer still declared unsolved. If it were possible to get an inside look at Project Saucer operations, I could soon tell whether it was an actual investigation or a deliberate cover-up for something else. Whichever it was, the wall of official secrecy still hid it. As a formality, I had called the Pentagon again and asked to talk with some of the project officers. As I expected, I was turned down. The only alternative was to dig out the story by talking with pilots and others who had been quizzed by project teams. I had several leads, and True had arranged some interviews for me. My first stop was Chicago, where I met an airline official and two commercial pilots. I saw the pilots first. Since they both talked in confidence, I will not use their right names. One, a Midwesterner I already knew, I'll call Pete Farrell. The other, a wartime instructor, Art Green. Pete was about 31, stocky, blue-eyed, with a pleasant, intelligent face. Art Green was a little older, a lean, sunburned, restless man with an emphatic voice. Pete had served with the Air Force during the war. He was now part owner of a flying school, also a pilot in the Air National Guard. Green was working for an air charter service. We met at the Palmer House. Art Green didn't need much prompting to talk about Project Saucer. After reporting a disk seen during a West Coast ride, he had been thoroughly grilled by a Project Saucer team. They practically took me apart, he said irritably. They've got a lot of trick questions. Some of them are figured out to trip up anybody faking a story. The way they worked on me, you'd think I committed a murder. Then they tried to sell me on the idea I'd seen a balloon, or maybe a plane, with the sun shining on it when it banked. I told them to go to the devil. I knew what I saw. After 17 years, I've got enough sense to tell a ship or a balloon when I see it. Did they believe you? I asked him. If they did, they didn't let on. Two of them acted as if they thought I was nuts. The other guy, I think he was Air Force intelligence, acted decent. He said not to get steamed up about the aeromedical boys. It was their job to screen out the crackpots. And on top of that, I found out later the FBI had checked up on me to find out if I was a liar or a screwball. They went around to my boss, people in my neighborhood, even the pilots in my outfit. My outfit's still razzing me. I wouldn't report another saucer if one flew through my cockpit. Pete Farrell hadn't encountered any Project Saucer teams personally, but he had some interesting angles. Some of the information had come from commercial and private pilots in the Midwest, part of it through National Guard contacts. I can tell you one thing, Pete said. Guard pilots got the same order as the Air Force. If we saw anything peculiar flying around, we were to do our damnedest to identify it. What about trying to bring one down? I've heard that was in one order. Pete hesitated for a second. Look, I told you that much because it's been in the papers. But I'm still in the Guard. I can't tell you the order itself. It was confidential. Well, I'm not in the Guard, said Art Green. He lit a cigarette, blew out the match. Why don't you look into the Gorman case? Get THC dope on that court-martial angle. I'd heard of the Gorman case, but the court-martial thing was new to me. Gorman, I recalled, was a fighter pilot in the North Dakota Air National Guard. He had a mystifying encounter with a strange, fast-moving light over Fargo Airport in the fall of 1948. "That case is on my list," I told Green. "But I don't remember anything about a court-martial." "It wasn't in the papers. But all the pilots up that way know about it." In his report, Gorman said something about trying to ram the thing. The idea got around that Air Force orders had said to try this. Anyway, it got into the papers and Gorman almost got court-martialed. If his family hadn't had some influence in the state, the Air Force probably would have pushed it. "Are you sure about this?" I said. "You know how those things build up." "Ask Gorman," he said. "Or ask some of the pilots at Fargo." Before I left them, Green double-checked my report on his sighting, which Hilton had forwarded. As in the majority of cases, he had seen just one disk. It had hovered at a very high altitude, gleaming in the sun, then had suddenly accelerated and raced off to the north. "I couldn't tell its size or speed," said Green. "But if it was as high as I think, it must have been pretty big." Pete told me later that Green believed the disk had been at least 20 miles high, because it was well above clouds at 30,000 feet. "It's kind of hard to believe," said Pete. "The thing would have to be a lot bigger than a B-29, and the speed over 2,000 miles an hour. "You know what they said about the Mantell saucer," I reminded him. "Some of the Godman-filled people said it was at least 300 feet in diameter." "I've heard it was twice that," said Pete. "You know any Kentucky National Guard pilots?" I asked. "One or two," said Pete. "But they couldn't tell me anything. It was hushed up too fast." That evening I talked with the airline official, whom I knew well enough to call by his first name. I put it to him bluntly. "Dick, if you're under orders not to talk, just tell me. I'm trying to find out whether Project Saucer has muzzled airline pilots." "You mean the ones who've sighted things?" "Perhaps, in a few cases. But most of the pilots know what happened to Captain Emil Smith, on United, and those Eastern pilots. They keep still so they won't be laughed at. Also, the airlines don't like their pilots to talk for publication." "I've heard of several cases," I said, "where Air Force intelligence is supposed to have warned pilots to keep mum. 2 of the reports come pretty straight." He made a gesture. "That could be. I'm not denying that airline pilots, and that includes ours, see these things all the time. They've been sighted on the Seattle-Alaska route, and between Anchorage and Japan. I know of several sources that pilots have seen between Honolulu and the mainland. Check with Pan American, you'll find their pilots have seen them, too." "What happens to those reports?" "They go to operations," said Dick. "Of course, if something really important happens, the pilot may radio the tower before he lands. Then the CAA gets word to the Air Force, and they rush some intelligence officers to quiz the pilots. If it's not too hot, they'd come from right field regular Project Saucer teams. Otherwise, they'd send the nearest intelligence officers to take over temporarily. I asked him if he had ever been in on one of these sessions. Dick said he hadn't. But a couple of pilots talked to me later. They said these Air Force men seemed quite upset about it. They pounced on everything these boys said about the thing's appearance, how it maneuvered and so on. What do your pilots think the saucers are? Dick gave me a slightly ironic grin. Why ask me? Captain Blake says you've been getting it firsthand. I wasn't pulling a fast one, I protested. We're not going to quote actual names or sources, unless people. Okay it. Sure, I know that, said Dick. But you've got THC answer already. Some pilots say interplanetary, some say guided missiles. A very few, still think it's all nonsense, because they haven't seen any. What do you think? I don't know the answer, said Dick, but I'm positive of one thing. Either the Air Force is sitting on a big secret, or they're badly scared because they don't know the answer. During the next week or so, I covered several Northwest and mountain states. Although I was chiefly trying to find out about Project Saucer, I ran onto 2 sightings that were not on my list. One of these had occurred in California, at Fairfield-Swaysan Air Force Base. A Seattle man who had been stationed there gave me the details. It was on the night of December 1918, with unusually high winds sweeping across the airfield. At times the gusts reached almost 70 miles an hour. Suddenly a weird ball of light flashed into view, at a height of 1,000 feet. As the men on the base watched it, astonished, the mysterious light abruptly shot skyward. In an incredibly short time, it reached an altitude of 20,000 feet and vanished. Was there any shape outlined behind the light? I asked the Seattle man. Nobody saw any, he replied. It looked just like I said, a ball of light, going like a streak. Did it leave any smoke behind it? You mean like an engine, or a jet? He shook his head. Not a thing. And it didn't make a sound even when it shot up like that. Did you hear any guesses about it, or reports later on? Some major who didn't see it said it must have been a balloon. Anybody with brains could see that was screwy. No balloon ever went up that fast, and besides, the thing was going against the wind. The second incident occurred at Salmon Dam, Idaho, on August 13, 1947. When I heard the date, it sounded familiar. I checked my sightings file and saw it was the same day as the strange affair at Twin Falls, Idaho. In the Twin Falls case, the disk was sighted by observers in a canyon. There was one interesting difference from the usual description. This disk was sky blue, or else its gleaming surface somehow reflected the sky because of the angle of vision. Although it was not close to the treetops, the observers were amazed to see the trees whip violently when the disk raced overhead, as though the air was boiling from the object's swift passage. At Salmon Dam, that same day, two miners heard an odd roaring sound and stared into the sky. Several miles away, two brightly gleaming discs were circling at high speed. It was like two round mirrors whirling around the sky. One of the men was later quoted as saying, "They couldn't have been any ordinary planes, not round like that. And they were going too fast." During this part of my trip, I also was told that one saucer had fallen into a mountain lake. This came to me secondhand. The lone witness was said to have rushed over to his car to get his camera as the disc approached. When it plunged toward the lake, he was so startled that he failed to snap the picture until the moment it struck. This story sounded so flimsy that I didn't bother to list it. Months later, a Washington newsman confirmed at least part of the lake story. When he first related it, I thought he had fallen for a gag. "I had that yarn," I said. "Don't tell me you believe it." "I come from Idaho," he told me. "And I happen to know the fellow who took the picture. Maybe it wasn't a disc, but something fell into that lake." "Did you see the picture?" "Yes, at the Pentagon." At my surprised look, he added, "That was long before they clamped down. I was talking to an Air Force officer about this lake thing, and he showed me the picture." "What did it look like?" "You couldn't tell much about it, just a big splash and a blur where something went under. Maybe a magnifying glass would bring it out, but I didn't get a chance to try it." It was early in 1950 when he told me this. I asked at the Pentagon if this picture was in the Wright Field files, and if so, whether I could see it. My inquiries drew blank looks. No one remembered such a photograph. And even if it were in the Project Saucer files, I couldn't see it. This was more than 2 months after Project Saucer had been officially closed and its secrets presumably all revealed. The rest of my interviews during this 1949 trip helped to round up my picture of Project Saucer operations. Some witnesses seemed afraid to talk, a few flatly refused. I found no proof of official pressure, but I frequently had the feeling that strong hints had been dropped. Though one or two witnesses showed resentment at investigators' methods, most of them seemed more annoyed at the loss of time involved. One man had been checked first by the police, then by the sheriff's office. An Air Force team had spent hours questioning him, returning the next day, and finally the FBI had made a character check. What he told me about the Air Force interrogation confirmed one of Art Green's statements. "One intelligence captain tried to tell me I'd seen a weather balloon. I called up the airport and had them check on release schedules. They said next day it didn't fit any schedules around this area."
Anyway, the wind wasn't right, because the thing I saw was cutting into the wind at a 45-degree angle. Other witnesses told me that investigators had suggested birds, meteors, reflections on clouds, shooting stars, and star shells as probable explanations of what they had seen. I learned of one pilot who had been startled by seeing a group of discs racing past his plane. Air Force investigators later suggested that he had flown through a flock of birds, or perhaps a cluster of balloons. On the flight back to Washington, I reread all the information the Air Force had released on Project Saucer. Suddenly, a familiar phrase caught my eye. I read over the paragraph again.
Preliminary study of the more than 240 domestic and 30 foreign incidents by astrophysicist Hynek indicates that an overall total of about 30% can probably be explained away as astronomical phenomena. Explained away. I went through the report line by line. On page 17 I found this. Available preliminary reports now indicate that a great number of sightings can be explained away as ordinary occurrences which have been misrepresented as a result of human errors. On page 22 I ran onto another use of the phrase. The obvious explanation for most of the spherical-shaped objects reported, as already mentioned, is that they are meteorological or similar type balloons. This, however, does not explain reports that they travel at high speed or maneuver rapidly. But saucer men point out that the movement could be explained away as an optical illusion or actual acceleration of the balloon caused by a gas leak and later exaggerated by observers. There are scores of possible explanations for the scores of different types sightings reported. Explained away. It might not mean anything. It could be just an unfortunate choice of words. But suppose that the real mission of Project Saucer was to cover up something, or that its purpose was to investigate something serious, at the same time covering it up step by step. The Project Saucer teams, then, would check on reports and simultaneously try to divert attention from the truth, suggesting various answers to explain the sightings. Back at Wright Field, analysts and intelligence officers would go over the general picture and try to work up plausible explanations, which, if necessary, could even be published. Explaining away would be one of the main purposes of project personnel. These words would probably be used in discussions of ways and means. They would undoubtedly be used in secret official papers. And since this published preliminary report had been made up from censored secret files, the use of those familiar words might have been overlooked, since, read casually, they would appear harmless. If the report had been thrown together hastily, the use of these telltale words could be easily understood, and so could the report's strange contradictions. As an experiment, I fixed the idea firmly in mind that Project Saucer was a cover-up unit. Then I went back once more and read the items quoted above. The effect was almost startling. It was as though I were reading confidential suggestions for diverting attention and explaining away the sightings. Suggestions made by project members and probably circulated for comment. Now, wait a minute, I said to myself. You may be dreaming up this whole thing. Trying to get back to a neutral viewpoint, I skimmed through the other details of project operations, as described in the report. The order creating Project Saucer was signed on December 30th, 1947. The actual code name was not Saucer, but since for some reason the Air Force still has not published the name, I have followed their usage of Saucer in its place. On January 22, 1948, 2 weeks after Captain Mantell's death, the project officially began operations. Preliminary investigation at Godman Field had been done by local intelligence officers. Project Saucer was set up under the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field.